So the Liberal Party is made up of two big factions. You have the Dries, best represented by someone like Tony Abbott, and the Wets, best represented by someone like Malcolm Turnbull. Now, the practical difference is about as much as the difference between Pokemon Fire Red and Pokemon Leaf Green, or X Factor using Natalie Bassingthwaighte as a judge instead of Natalie Imbruglia. But these are the big factions within the party and have been responsible for the knifing of two prime ministers in the last decade. And if we want to truly understand where this factional difference came from, we have to understand this guy, Malcolm Fraser. A lot of people will say that Robert Menzies is the father of the Liberal Party, but for me, he's not at all the father of the modern Liberal Party. He belongs in the era of white Australia banning the Communist Party and being afraid to trade with Asia. So to understand what's going on behind the scenes with the current Liberal Party, stick around as we look at our first wet, Malcolm Fraser. So in an effort that would truly make T-Pain and Neo proud, Fraser's entire election campaign against the sacked Gough Whitlam centred on the phrase "turn on the lights", essentially a call to economic salvation after the Whitlam government endured both high inflation and rising unemployment. Now, it's worth noting that these conditions were affecting the entire world and it wasn't a Whitlam-specific issue. This phenomenon was given a title, stagflation, as it captured the effects of a stagnant economy, particularly wages, with rising inflation. Up until the 70s, economists actually thought that this was impossible, and if you want to learn more about it, I unpack it in a fair amount of detail in our video on Gerald Ford. So the program that Fraser campaigned on was one that was actually going to be really popular with the business elite. It involved annual economic growth of 6 to 7%, big corporate tax cuts, a tighter budget with less social spending, the abolition of the Prices Justification Tribunal, which reported on unfair pricing, and the introduction of tax and wage indexation. If you're like me, trying to pretend I understand what's going on when the mechanic's explaining what's wrong with my car, essentially, indexation involves taxes and wages rising each year in accordance with inflation. To carry out this initiative, he dumped a guy called Don Chipp and promoted two deputies, Philip Lynch and another guy you might have heard of called John Howard. Chipp was furious at being relegated out of cabinet and he defected to form the Australian Democrats Party, which would end up proving fatal, but more on that later. However, Fraser's attempt to enact his economic policy faced an early blow when the Australian Council of Trade Unions, who was then led by Bob Hawke of all people, forced Fraser to abolish the Price Justification Tribunal. It wouldn't be Fraser's last defeat to the unions. But this was seen as only a peripheral blow to the agenda, and Fraser then sought to target the inflation aspect of stagflation. His belief was that spending reductions would limit the amount of money in circulation, and therefore bring inflation under control. With inflation under control, there'd be greater consumer confidence, increased international competitiveness, and consumers would be less worried about their savings being devalued. All of this would then lead to a reduction in unemployment. It's also worth noting that this challenged the orthodoxy of the time, which was in fact that increased government spending would fix the issue of unemployment. So in 1976, the Fraser government increased spending by 11%, half of Labor's 1975 increase of 22%. However, though Fraser had his guy Philip Lynch as treasurer, the Treasury Department itself were really reluctant to implement these spending reductions. In just as equally a monumental moment of history, it was during Fraser's tenure that Jamboree opened, and so heeding their instruction to control the action, Fraser created a whole new department, the Department of Finance, and had Lynch oversee that portfolio too. After 2 years, inflation was reduced to less than 10%, but it hadn't actually fixed the issue of unemployment. And so Fraser's attention turned away from inflation to the stagnant part of stagflation and offered huge tax cuts. Actually, it was just totally a way of bribing people into voting for him in 1977, but it worked a treat as he smashed Gough Whitlam in the rematch. Essentially, he reduced a 7-tier tax bracket system to just 3, 32%, 46%, and 60%. Much greater than today, but dropping a couple of percentage points for most Australians at the time. However, after coming back to power at the end of 1977, he quickly reversed it with a 1.5% tax increase and abolished the indexation system. It was just as quick as when you change tabs from Cricket 07 to board and chain walkways in Year 9 geography. So with all these tax cuts, inflation was rising once again to about 10%, and unemployment was getting a little bit better, stabilising at 6%. But in 1979, there was a massive drop in Middle Eastern oil production for a number of reasons, video for another day. And so Australia turned to alternative sources of energy. Luckily, Australia had an abundance of another energy source, coal, and the 70s were very early days in understanding its effect on the environment. So Australia went through a coal mining boom in which $29 billion were invested into the boom. As inflation continued to rise once again, wages rose disproportionately to productivity, and quite simply, the unions had Fraser's number. For instance, Fraser totally caved to the Transport Union because he was in a hurry to get to Charles and Diana's royal wedding. Fraser had certainly given the business community what they wanted, but with unemployment now standing at 9%, his treasurer Philip Lynch having to resign for using a family trust to dodge tax, and then his new treasurer John Howard unsuccessfully advocating for a goods and service tax, there was simply no way Fraser could boast of fixing the issues he accused Whitlam of leaving behind. He would have to brand his legacy another way, and it proved to be one entirely new to the Liberal Party. So before I tell you what Fraser viewed his biggest achievement as, I want to ask you this question. Where does Fraser rank in the list of greatest Liberal Prime Ministers? Also, we have to be one of the most historically illiterate nations in the world. You can help buck that trend by liking this video and sharing it with one of your friends. The more Aussies we have watching this series, the more we can actually resource the videos. And let's be real, you don't have the time to do research on this one, and so subscribe to save hours of reading. So Fraser said his greatest policy achievement was creating a multicultural Australia. If you're thinking, that sounds a little woke to be coming out of the mouth of a 70s Liberal Prime Minister, your instincts aren't entirely wrong. And Fraser's social policy would end up creating a new style of branding for future Liberal MPs. So firstly, Fraser decided to continue Whitlam's policy of self-determination. My last uni assignment was actually writing an essay on this very topic. Without trying to get too heavy on the details, I think the better way of phrasing things was that he watered down Whitlam's idea of self-determination. In 1975, Fraser voted against Whitlam's land rights bill for the Northern Territory, and in 1986 passed his own bill which removed the term self-determination to be replaced by the term self-management. The main effect of this was that Indigenous land councils could not now task entry permits to mining companies. That being said, Fraser was still a long way from the Liberal Party's previous policy of assimilation. Secondly, Fraser also supported Whitlam ending the White Australia policy. Now, although it was Whitlam who ended preferential treatment to European migrants, Whitlam opted for a low migration rate, reducing the number of annual migrants from 150,000 to just 30,000. Remember, trade unions favour a low migration rate to protect labour standards for existing citizens, and so that's another reason as to why it's really wrong to equate Labour with the corporately backed Democrats in America. Fraser restored those migration numbers to 120,000 annual migrants, except unlike his Liberal predecessors, had multicultural migration, particularly Vietnamese immigrants. In 1980, SBS also began operations, and on this one I'm torn. On the one hand, I'm thankful to Fraser for giving us Les Murray, on the other, he gave us the feed. To put it simply, Fraser allowed the Liberal Party to brand themselves as forward-thinking, while also rejecting the economic forward-thinking that Whitlam had instituted. Another reason why Fraser was really weird was that for the time, he was kind of a woke cold warrior. I suppose a modern equivalent would be Kamala Harris with China or something. So Fraser really disliked that during the 70s, America was pursuing a policy of détente, and thought that Ford and Carter were far too soft. In 1976, he actually urged them to take a more resolute stance. As part of the Greater Cold War, Fraser was a huge supporter of using China against the Soviets, and in 1976 also went to visit Hua Guofeng. If you have no idea who that is, he was the guy who Mao chose to replace him after his death in the same year. We've done a whole video on him, and he was ousted by Deng Xiaoping before exerting any real power over China. Now, normally, the Cold Warriors were pretty chilled on what was going on in Southern Africa because South Africa and Rhodesia were seen as important anti-communist powers. But again, Fraser broke the stereotype by taking a hardline stance against apartheid and supported all forms of boycott against them. He also played a key role in ending Ian Smith's illegal Rhodesia regime and was actually the intermediary between independence leaders and Margaret Thatcher. He pushed Thatcher into supporting an independent Zimbabwe with a new constitution and pushed African leaders to also abandon military intervention. Fraser boosted defence spending, supported Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, and unsuccessfully tried to get Australia to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Just as a side note, if any of you guys figured out how to sprint really fast on Athens Olympics on PS2, I've tried the pencil cheat, but it didn't work. Do you know this guy from Sky News, Richo? Well, he was actually really important in the Labour Party during Fraser's time and would go on to help take him down. So after Whitlam lost the 1977 rematch to Malcolm Fraser, he stepped down and a guy called Bill Hayden took his spot. Hayden gained ground on Fraser, and in 1980 even took the Senate off the Libs, as it was now controlled by Labor and the Australian Democrats led by our old mate, Don Chipp. In 1982, rumours began to circle that Labor's new guy, Bob Hawke, might take down Hayden in a leadership spill, but Hawke was reluctant to pull the trigger, knowing it could badly damage their election chances. At this point, Fraser was getting nervy and knew that he had a much better chance against Hayden than against the rising Hawke, and he wanted to have an early snap election. In a weird twist of fate, this would be made impossible as Fraser was hospitalised with back issues, and in 1983, on the same day as Fraser announced the election, Bill Hayden stepped down to allow Hawke to run. Now, Hayden was furious about this as Richo had pulled heaps of support away from him to instead give to Hawke, and so he was really pressured into stepping down. With unemployment so high, Labor took 24 seats off of the Libs and Hawke won in a landslide election. Australia was now truly ready for a series of reforms that would change the nation forever. If you want to watch that video, click here in a week's time, and while you wait, click here to watch a video on the CIA ousting a democratically elected leader of the Congo and then pillaging them for their uranium. It's a really wild ride.